Amid a blizzard in the far north, a Navy SEAL on medical leave stopped at an abandoned house that looked as if nothing inside could still be alive. But in the darkness of that place, he and his loyal German shepherd found a wounded mother dog curled tightly around her 3 newborn puppies. She was trembling, exhausted, and staring at everything with the eyes of a creature pushed to the very edge of fear. Then the soldier realized the most terrifying thing was not the storm outside, but the fact that someone was already coming back to take her away. And so, in that white frozen night, one man and one dog found themselves standing between fragile life and something far more cruel. If you also believe that loyalty, kindness, and quiet miracles still exist in this world, tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Help us reach 1,000 followers so we can continue creating more meaningful stories like this. And now, let's begin. Winter light in the far north had a way of making everything look honest. It did not soften edges. It did not flatter old wood, dented metal, tired faces, or roads that had been plowed too many times and repaired too few. It laid itself across the world in a clear, pale sheet and left things exactly as they were. The frozen fields outside North Hollow Ridge shone under it. The black lines of the pines stood sharp against a sky so cold and clean it looked almost brittle. The snow along the roadside had hardened into gray-white ridges, where tires and weather had fought each other for weeks. Kyle Rowan noticed all of it, because noticing was easier than thinking. At 35, he still carried himself like a man who had spent too many years answering to timing, distance, and command. He stood about 6 feet tall, lean rather than bulky, his body built for endurance and efficient force instead of display. His face was clean-shaven, the dark stubble kept off as if discipline had settled into his skin and refused to leave. Without a beard to soften him, his square jaw and defined cheekbones were plain under the winter light. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, though slightly longer than regulation might once have allowed, and the wind coming off the northern ridge pushed a few strands out of place. His skin was fair beneath the cold, but the kind of fair that had been weathered by outdoor work and harsher seasons. His eyes were gray-blue, steady, and difficult to read. They were not the hard eyes of a cruel man. They were worse, sometimes, for being patient. They looked as though they had seen too much to waste energy judging what could not be changed in a moment. He drove slowly through the outskirts of town, in an old pickup that sounded healthier than he felt. The injury in his shoulder was the reason he was here, not because he wanted to talk about it, not because he had chosen this place out of sentiment. It was simpler than that. The shoulder had taken enough damage on his last deployment that someone higher up had said words like rest, recovery, and limited duty in a tone that made clear they were orders, not suggestions. Kyle had accepted the leave the way a man accepted bad weather. Arguing with it changed nothing. Still, he did not know what to do with long daylight hours that belonged to nobody and demanded nothing. So he came north, rented a modest cabin outside town, and started taking repair jobs from anyone who needed a pump checked, a heater coaxed back to life, a sagging door rehung, or a stubborn engine convinced to keep going a little longer. Work, he understood. Stillness, less so. In the passenger seat sat the one creature who seemed entirely comfortable with silence. Rook, a 6-year-old German shepherd, watched the road with the contained alertness of an animal who had learned early that the world usually told the truth before people did. He was a working-line dog, not oversized, not showy, but strong in the practical way that mattered. His coat ran cream through gray into black along the back, the sable coloring roughened by winter air and old use rather than polished for beauty. His amber eyes missed very little. A black harness wrapped his chest and shoulders, edged in a dark red trim that showed only when the light struck it right. There was a top handle worn smooth by human hands. Rook had the stillness of a dog who did not waste emotion on anything that had not yet earned it. Kyle rested one hand on the wheel, the other near the console, careful of the shoulder even when the road was smooth. He did not like the involuntary caution in his own movements. It made him feel older than 35, and less useful than he wanted to be. The tactical combat shirt he wore had faded into the tired gray of long service. The fabric had softened over time, the cuffs and shoulders lightly frayed, the color worn pale in places by repeated washing and weather. A dark red thermal layer showed faintly at the collar. His old combat pants were earth brown with hints of green, the knees scuffed, the cargo pockets slightly slack from use. His work boots were scarred but dependable. The military watch on his wrist had more scratches than shine. It all suited the truck, the road, and the season. Nothing about him suggested vacation. North Hollow Ridge itself seemed to have been built by people who distrusted decoration. The main stretch held a hardware store, a diner, a gas station, a feed supply shop, a church with plain siding, and houses set back from the road under old spruce and pine. Smoke rose from chimneys in patient vertical lines whenever the wind settled. There was beauty here, but it did not perform for strangers. It simply existed and waited to see who stayed. Kyle had been in town less than 2 days, and already people were beginning to look at him with that rural mixture of caution and practical acceptance reserved for new men who knew how to fix things. He preferred that to friendliness. Friendliness expected return. Practical need was cleaner. By late afternoon, he had finished checking a generator behind the feed store and was heading back toward the cabin by a quieter road that skirted the edge of the forest. The sun had lowered but not yet faded, and the snow in the tree line held an odd blue tint where shadow had already begun to gather. The pines stood dense there, darker than the open land, their trunks close enough together to make the woods feel less like scenery and more like a wall. Kyle did not think anything of it at first. Rook did. The dog rose without sound. It happened so quickly and so completely that Cale felt it before he properly saw it. A shift in the air inside the cab, a change in attention. 1 second Rook had been settled, calm, observant. The next, he was standing with all 4 paws planted, ears forward, head angled towards the forest. Not barking, not bristling, just fixed. Kyle eased his foot off the accelerator. "What is it?" Rook did not look at him. The dog's body was alert, but not panicked, which mattered. Panic could come from anything. This was different. It was the kind of focus that meant something had entered the edges of his awareness and stayed there. Kyle drove another 20 yards, slower now. The road curved slightly, bordered on one side by packed snow and on the other by a rough stand of pine that rose over shallow ground and old fence posts nearly swallowed by drifts. No movement, no vehicle, no person, only winter. Yet Rook remained standing. Cale felt the old habit return, that quiet tightening in his thoughts when the ordinary stopped behaving like itself. It was not fear. Fear was hot and immediate. This was colder, a process, a narrowing. He pulled the truck onto the shoulder as far as the frozen edge allowed and killed the engine. Silence came down hard after the motor stopped, thickened by snow and distance. Somewhere far off, a raven called once and then seemed to reconsider. Kyle sat without moving for a breath, then another. There had been plenty of moments in his life when the wrong decision began, with ignoring something small because it did not yet look important. He had learned to distrust that instinct. The wind moved across the tree line with a low, dry whisper. Rook remained standing, eyes fixed, nose testing the air now in short, careful draws. Kyle opened the door and stepped out. Cold met him instantly, sharp enough to press through cloth and old injury alike. He rolled his shoulder once and regretted it. The pain was not terrible, just enough to remind him that his body had opinions about how useful it intended to be. He shut the truck door carefully behind him and listened. Nothing. Then, maybe not a sound, exactly. More like the absence of the right kind of stillness. Rook jumped down from the passenger side and came around the front of the truck. He did not lunge towards the woods. He did not pull. He simply stood beside Kyle, angled toward the pines, his posture saying with unmistakable clarity that whatever mattered lay there and not anywhere else. Kyle looked at the forest edge. Snow had collected in the low brush. A line of old wooden posts disappeared into the trees, half-rotted and tilted. Beyond them, the woods thickened quickly. The late light did strange things under pine cover. It turned open space into shadow and shadow into suggestions. He crouched slightly, not because he needed to, but because lowering himself changed how the land revealed things. Tracks, broken branches, disturbance. He saw no obvious path, no fresh tire marks from the road, no human figure where one should not be. And yet Rook did not move. That mattered more than the lack of evidence. Kyle rested one hand on the dog's neck for a second, feeling the contained energy there beneath coarse winter fur. Rook's breathing was calm. His muscles were not trembling with aggression. Whatever he had caught in the air had not told him fight. It had told him notice. The sky above the ridge had begun to pale toward evening, and the cold sharpened with it. Kyle knew enough not to walk blindly into dense woods near dusk without reason. He also knew enough not to dismiss a dog like Rook when every trained instinct in him had settled on a single point beyond sight. Something was there, or had been, or would matter soon. Kyle straightened slowly and studied the line where road became forest. The world offered him nothing dramatic. No cry for help, no moving silhouette, no omen worthy of a story told later. Only a dog who would not look away, and a silence that felt a little too deliberate, as if the pines were holding something they had not decided to show yet. He glanced once down the empty road, then back toward the trees. "Okay," he said quietly, more to the moment than to the dog. Rook's ears twitched, but he did not relax. The last of the light touched the high branches, and for one strange second Kyle felt the afternoon tip into something else. Not danger exactly, not yet, but the first hinge of it. The sort of moment a man could pass by if he wanted a simpler evening. Kyle stood in the cold beside his truck, the forest in front of him and the dog at his side, and knew with the calm certainty that had outlived every uniform he had ever worn that the day was not finished just because the sun was leaving it. Something had begun. And Rook had heard it first. Kale did not go into the trees that evening, not because he dismissed what Rook had sensed, and not because curiosity had failed him. He stayed out because winter in the north punished men who confused instinct with haste. Dusk had already thickened under the pines, and a shoulder that still stiffened in the cold was reason enough not to wander blind into dense forest on uncertain ground. He stood for another minute at the roadside, letting the silence settle around him until it became only silence again, then opened the truck door and gave Rook a quiet command. The dog obeyed, but not easily. Rook climbed back into the passenger seat with the restrained reluctance of a soldier following orders he did not agree with. His amber eyes stayed on the woods until Kyle pulled back onto the road. That was enough to keep the matter alive in Kyle's mind all night. He slept badly in the cabin outside North Hollow Ridge, waking twice to the old mechanical groan of the baseboard heater, and once to the shoulder pulling hard with a dull, sour ache. The cabin itself had no charm worth describing. It was practical, square, and clean in the way rental places were clean swept, functioning, impersonal. A small wood porch, a narrow kitchen, 2 rooms, a table scarred by years of cups set down without coasters. Still, the place had heat, a decent lock, and enough distance from town to feel useful. Kyle had known worse shelter in better circumstances. By morning the sky had cleared into a pale, pitiless blue. The kind of winter morning that looked harmless until a man stepped into it and found the air sharp enough to cut the inside of his lungs. Kyle drank coffee standing up, one hand around the mug, the other braced against the counter while he read a handwritten note someone had left wedged under his wiper the day before. It had come from the feed store owner, who knew everyone's broken machinery and half the town's business. A pump line at Harold Pike's place had gone bad again. If Cale had time, Harold was asking. He had time. That was the trouble with leave. It gave a man too much room for memory and not enough excuse to ignore it. Rook was waiting by the truck before Cale reached the door. The dog wore his black harness with the dark red trim, the strap across his chest sitting snug against thick sable fur. 6 years old now, old enough to have settled into himself, Rook moved with quiet certainty. He did not waste motion. He had the kind of patience that could look like calm to a stranger and like vigilance to anyone who knew him. Kyle paused long enough to check the fit of the harness and rest a hand against the dog's neck. We'll see what the old man needs. Rook's ears shifted once, accepting the plan without interest. He liked work more than explanations. Harold Pike's farm sat on the outer edge of settled land, where the town's practical order gave way to weather, trees, and distance. The house was old, but not falling. The outbuildings leaned under years of repaired damage. Snow had drifted against the fences in uneven ridges, and the fields beyond them lay flat and white beneath the cold sun. The place looked as though it had been held together one winter at a time, by a man too stubborn to surrender to neglect. Harold himself came out of the side door before Kyle had killed the engine. He was in his late 60s, maybe older, narrow through the shoulders but not fragile, one of those men winter had dried out rather than defeated. His face was lined deep around the mouth and eyes, the skin reddened and roughened by years of wind. What hair he had left was mostly white, and cut with no interest in style. A gray stubble shadowed his jaw, because shaving every day had long ago ceased to seem useful. He wore a flannel shirt beneath a canvas coat, patched at one elbow, wool gloves with one fingertip darned clumsily, and boots that had seen enough mud and snow to lose any original color they'd been made in. "Rowan?" he asked. "Cale." Harold nodded, as if names mattered less after 40. "Pump line under the back shed froze again. Thought I'd fixed it last week. Turns out I was lying to myself." It was the closest thing to humor his face made. Kyle followed him around the house toward a low utility shed near the rear fence. The shoulder tugged when he lifted his tool bag from the truck, but he kept the reaction off his face. He had found that pain was like bad weather in another way. Acknowledging it too much gave it authority it had not earned. Harold walked with a slight stiffness in his right knee, not enough to call it a limp, but enough to suggest old farm damage that had never met a surgeon. He did not fill silence to be polite. Kyle appreciated that immediately. "You new in town?" Harold said after a while. "More or less." "Heard you fix what people can't." "I fix what still wants fixing." That earned him a brief side glance. Not warm, not skeptical. Measuring. The pump line issue proved ordinary enough to be almost disappointing. A cracked section near the coupling, a poor repair done in weather too cold for patience, and a pressure inconsistency that had probably been coming for months. Kyle worked with gloved hands and steady attention, kneeling in packed snow beside the shed while Harold watched from a few feet back. Rook moved the perimeter once, nose low, checking doors, tires, wood piles, corners. Then he stopped. Not near Cale. Not near Harold. At the back edge of the property, beyond the shed and close to where the land dipped toward the trees, Rook turned his head and held still. Cale kept working. He did not look up right away. One thing military life had taught him was that reacting too quickly to a signal often frightened civilians and ruined useful observation. He tightened the replacement fitting, checked the seal, ran the line once more in his mind, then stood slowly and tested the pump. It caught with a low rattle, then steadied. Harold exhaled through his nose. That'll do. Kyle wiped his hand on a rag and followed the angle of Rook's attention. Beyond the property line stood a weather-worn structure half sunk into the edge of neglect. It might once have been a storage barn, small and square, built of old timber gone gray with age. One side leaned slightly inward. Snow had drifted against the baseboards. The doors were shut, but not well. The place looked unused in the way some buildings pretended to be unused. Yours? Cale asked. Harold's face changed by almost nothing, which was enough to notice. Been on the land longer than me. You use it? No. Rook had not moved. Cale watched the barn for another second. What's in it? Harold's mouth flattened. Nothing worth your time. The answer came too quickly and sat between them with the weight of something practiced. Kyle had heard that tone before from men hiding drink, debt, injury, shame, or fear. It rarely meant nothing. He bent to gather his tools. Dog doesn't seem to agree. Harold looked at Rook, then, really looked. The old man's eyes narrowed, not with annoyance, but with the guarded respect country people reserved for animals that noticed what people preferred not to. For a long moment he said nothing. The wind pushed through the fence wires with a low hum. Somewhere beyond the field, a crow gave an ugly call. Then Harold spoke without looking at Kyle. Last winter I had 2 dogs. Farm dogs, mutts mostly, but good ones. One old black female, one young red male with more nerve than sense. Both gone now. Kyle straightened, tool bag in hand. Coyotes? He asked. Harold gave a dry shake of the head. Would have found blood. Tracks, something. He kept his eyes on the barn. They started hearing things at night first, back in the trees. Not barking the way dogs bark at foxes or deer. Different. Then they wouldn't come near that side of the property. 2 weeks later, the old female vanished. The younger one went missing before dawn, 3 days after. The old man's voice was steady, but something old and sour lay beneath it. Not grief exactly, but the bitterness of a man who had been denied the dignity of certainty. You look? Cale said. I looked. Harold rubbed a gloved thumb against the seam of his coat. Found nothing I could prove. Heard enough to stop liking the dark back there. Kyle said nothing. He understood the phrase, nothing I could prove better than Harold likely intended. Harold turned to face him at last. In full light, his eyes were pale and tired, the sort of eyes that had spent years reading weather, livestock, and bad luck with equal accuracy. You asked what's in that shed. Truth is, I don't know anymore. Used to store feed years ago. Then old parts. Then nothing. I quit checking when the checking stopped feeling useful. Kyle followed his gaze to the leaning barn again. Rook took 3 quiet steps toward it. That was when Kyle felt the change. Not in the air this time. In the dog. Rook's posture softened and sharpened at once, a contradiction Cale knew well enough to respect. It was not the rigid focus of threat, not the twitching excitement of prey. It was something else. Caution laced with attention, the way he had once approached injured animals on training grounds, or men hurt badly enough that every movement near them could be mistaken for harm. Kyle set the tool bag down. Harold noticed. You hear something? No. Then what? Cale looked at Rook. He doesn't think it's empty. The old man stared a moment longer at the barn, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost even the pretense of dismissal. "You planning to go in there?" Kyle did not answer immediately. He walked instead, slow and deliberate, boots pressing into wind-hardened snow. Rook went ahead a few feet, then stopped near the half-buried threshold. The dog did not paw the door. He did not bark. He simply lowered his head, ears forward, waiting. Harold did not follow right away. When he did, he came reluctantly, as if every step toward the barn was a concession made against instinct. Up close, the building smelled of old pine, rust, cold straw, and something else beneath it, something faintly sour and animal. Kyle rested his hand against the rough wood of the door. It was colder than stone. The metal latch had reddened with rust. He looked once at Rook. The dog glanced up, then back at the narrow gap where the doors met. That was all. Kyle pulled the latch free. The door opened with a dragging wooden groan, and stale, cold air moved out around them, carrying dust, dry rot, and a smell that was suddenly unmistakable now that it had been released. Animal. Fear. Milk. Blood gone old at the edges. The interior was dim even in daylight. Slats of winter sun cut through cracks in the boards and laid thin bars of light across the floor. Old crates leaned against one wall. A coil of wire sat beneath a shelf. Broken tools, a sack torn open and half-rotted, a mound of old tarp in the corner. It would have been easy, at first glance, to mistake the place for what it pretended to be: abandoned storage, ignored by everyone and useful to no one. Then Rook stepped inside and went still. He turned not toward the center of the barn, but toward the far rear corner, where a collapsed stack of feed sacks and splintered plywood had created a shallow pocket of shadow against the wall. Kyle heard it before he saw anything. A small sound, not even a cry, not. More like the weak, irregular effort of something trying not to be noticed. Harold swore under his breath. It was not a loud curse. It sounded like prayer spoken by a man who had stopped believing in being answered. Kyle moved forward carefully, his breath quieter now, every instinct narrowing. He knew without knowing yet that there are moments in life when a door opens onto a problem larger than the doorway, and a man has 1 second to decide whether he is the sort who closes it again. He knelt near the broken sacks and reached aside a piece of warped board. Behind it lay a dog. A female, shepherd-blooded if not pure, curled so tightly around 3 tiny bodies that she seemed built entirely from pain and refusal. Her coat was a dirty mix of black and pale tan beneath dust and old straw, once thick and healthy, but now rough and thinned at the flanks. A raw ring marked the fur at her neck where something had rubbed too long and too hard. One shoulder carried a healed, then reopened wound, ugly with strain. Her ribs showed. Her eyes, brown, washed with gold, lifted to Kyle, wide and exhausted, and so full of warning they seemed older than the dog herself. The puppies were barely more than warm scraps of life. Newborn, or close enough. Small bodies pressed against her belly, one twitching faintly, one hidden almost entirely under her foreleg, one letting out the weak sound Kyle had heard from outside. The mother tried to rise. She failed. The effort ended in a shudder and a low, broken growl with almost no strength behind it. Rook did something then that made Harold inhale sharply. The German shepherd lowered himself to the floor. Not near enough to crowd, not far enough to abandon. He turned his head slightly aside, presenting no challenge, no hard stare, only presence. Calm, deliberate. A bridge offered without force. The mother dog's eyes shifted to him. Her body remained tense as wire, but she did not try again to stand. Cale stayed exactly where he was, hands open, gaze lowered just enough to take pressure out of the moment. Behind him, Harold whispered, almost to himself, "Dear God." Cale looked at the weak mother, the 3 trembling pups, the raw collar mark, the wound, the filth, the impossible fact of them hidden here on the edge of an old man's land. And he knew, with the cold certainty that always came before difficult work, that nothing about this was simple anymore. The pump was fixed. The day was not. He did not move closer, but neither did he leave. Cale did not leave Harold Pike's barn for a long time. He stayed where he was, half crouched in the cold dimness, letting the scene settle into him without forcing it into meaning too quickly. The mother dog's breathing came shallow and uneven, as if each breath had to be argued into existence. Her body remained wrapped around the 3 puppies with a kind of exhausted determination that felt less like instinct and more like refusal. The little ones barely moved. One had a tiny paw pressed against the underside of her chest. Another shivered once and then went still again, except for the minute rise and fall that proved it had not given up. The third was tucked so deeply into the warmth beneath her foreleg that Cale could only see the faintest movement in the straw. Harold stood several feet behind him, boots planted, hands hanging useless at his sides. He looked like a man who had spent a year suspecting something rotten lay near his land, and had not expected the truth to arrive with fur, milk, and blood. The lines in his weather-cut face seemed deeper in the barn light. His pale eyes had gone glassy, not with tears, but with a harsher kind of recognition. Regret, when it arrived too late, often looked like silence. "She's been in here a while," Cale said quietly. Harold swallowed before answering. "How can you tell?" Cale kept his gaze on the dog. Straws flattened beneath her. Dirt at the flanks settled in layers, not fresh. The wounds reopened, but it's older than today. He shifted slightly, careful not to angle his body like a threat. "She picked this place because it blocks wind and nobody comes in. Except us." The mother dog's eyes flicked toward Harold at the sound of his voice, and the muscles along her jaw tightened. It took almost no strength for fear to return to her face. Cale filed that away. Her fear was not generalized. It sharpened with male voices, with height, with movement. That meant history. Rook remained low on the barn floor, his body long and still, his amber gaze softened by instinct and training into something that offered no challenge. He did not inch closer. He did not look directly at the puppies. His calm seemed to widen the space rather than fill it. Cale had seen him do that before, with frightened animals, and with people not far from breaking. It was one of the reasons he trusted the dog more than he trusted most men. Cale eased backward one step. The mother dog did not relax, but she did not try to rise again either. "Need water," he said. "Maybe warmth. Not touch, not yet?" Harold gave a rough nod. "I've got old feed pans, towels in the house. My daughter used to leave things there for the dogs when she visited." His voice changed slightly on the word daughter, enough to suggest distance or loss, perhaps only geography, perhaps more. "I'll get them." Cale glanced over his shoulder. "Move slow when you come back." Harold understood the instruction without offense. That, too, Cale noticed. Men who lived alone a long time learned not to waste pride on practical truths. Once the old man left, the barn seemed to settle around Cale and the dogs. The outside world thinned to the creak of timber, the whisper of wind through warped seams, and the far-off metallic tap of something loose against the side of the shed. Dust and old feed smell lingered under the stronger sense of damp fur and blood. Cale let the quiet work. He remained where he was, knees beginning to complain, shoulder tugging in the cold, and watched the mother dog watch him back. He had dealt with fear in many forms. Human fear sometimes hid itself behind anger, humor, charm, lies. Animal fear was cleaner. It never pretended to be anything else. "You're not safe," he said softly, not because he thought she understood the words, but because tone mattered. "But you're not alone now." Rook's ears moved once at the sound of his voice. The mother dog's eyes shifted briefly to him, then back to Cale. For one impossible second, something in that look seemed less like panic and more like calculation. Not trust. Never that. But assessment. Could he be tolerated? Could he be survived? It was more than he had expected. Harold returned with an old metal pan, 2 towels, and a dented thermos. He had also added a wool blanket, faded green, and patched near one corner. He stopped just inside the door, waiting for direction like a man relieved to be given one. Kyle took the pan, poured a little water from the thermos into it, and slid it forward only halfway before stopping. The mother dog tracked the motion with brutal concentration. He left it there, not close enough to threaten her space, only near enough for the scent of it to reach. The puppies made a thin, broken sound at almost the same time, and the mother lowered her muzzle over them with trembling urgency. Kyle took one towel and folded it slowly, then placed it near the pan. "We'll leave her room," Harold nodded. "Sheriff?" Cale thought about it. The collar mark, the wound, the puppies, the hidden barn, the old man's vanished dogs. He also thought about evidence, proof, the kind of report that got filed and ignored because too much was rumor and too little could be held in the hand. "Maybe," he said. "Not yet." Harold did not like that answer, but he accepted it. "You think somebody put her here?" "No." Kyle looked around the barn. "I think somebody made her afraid enough that she found this on her own." That sat between them for a while. When Kyle finally stood, his knees cracked softly, and his shoulder burned down into his upper arm. He ignored it. There was nothing more he could safely do for the dogs without breaking the fragile balance Rook had helped create. He and Harold backed out of the barn, leaving the door pulled almost closed to block the wind while still allowing enough air. Rook came last, pausing at the threshold to glance back once before stepping out. In the brighter daylight, the cold felt harsher. It bit through his shirt and made the old scar tissue in his shoulder tighten into a single hard knot. Harold looked older out here than he had in the barn. "What now?" the old man asked. Kyle scanned the ground around the barn, letting his eyes work while his mind stayed quiet. Packed snow, old boot marks near the shed from Harold's own use. Tire impressions half drifted over near the side road. Some old, some maybe newer. Hard to tell without crouching into them. Then he saw it. A shallow track in the snow beside the rear wall, narrow and linear, too regular for chance. He bent to inspect it. Not a tire. Not exactly. More like something dragged or rolled on a smaller frame. The mark disappeared beneath drifted powder a few feet later. "Harold," he said, still crouched. "You ever have anyone from a rescue come through? Animal control? Anyone asking questions?" The old man frowned, thinking. "Last month, maybe. A vehicle I didn't know. Dark SUV. Thought they were lost. Drove slow along the back road and turned around by the tree line." "Did they stop?" "Not at the house." Harold looked toward the forest. "But I heard an engine later on." Kyle straightened. That was when Rook changed. The dog, who had been standing beside the barn door, lifted his head sharply and turned toward the driveway. Not toward the woods. Toward the road. Kyle followed the line of his attention just as the distant sound reached him. An engine, steady and controlled, not farm equipment, not local in the casual way local vehicles usually moved. This one approached with purpose, not speed. Harold heard it a second later. The old man's mouth flattened. A dark SUV rolled into view beyond the fence and came slowly up the snow-packed drive. Clean vehicle, clean lines, not new but maintained. It did not belong to a man who let machinery die from neglect. It stopped near Cale's truck with deliberate care, engine running, heater probably on inside. After a moment, 3 men stepped out. The first was the one who clearly expected to do the talking. Lucas Vane moved with the sort of polished efficiency that tried to pass for reassurance. He was perhaps 40, tall and lean in a way that suggested he worked at keeping himself composed rather than strong. His face was narrow, handsome if a person liked angles more than warmth, clean-shaven, with dark hair neatly clipped and tucked beneath a charcoal knit cap. His skin had the pale indoor smoothness of a man who spent more time with paperwork and staged concern than with weather. He wore a dark technical jacket with a stitched logo over the chest. Iron Valley Animal Recovery. His gloves were black, his boots expensive, his smile measured. The second man came around the passenger side carrying a handheld device with an antenna. He was broader, red-faced from the cold or habit, with a trimmed beard and a heavy jacket zipped too tightly across the stomach. He looked less like rescue and more like hired help, who had been told what to call himself. The third stepped out last. He was younger, maybe 28, with wind-reddened skin and a face that had not yet decided whether it wanted to harden or stay open. His build was wiry and ordinary. Brown hair showed beneath his hat in damp strands. There was stubble along his jaw, not styled, just neglected. His coat bore the same Iron Valley patch, but it sat differently on him, as if he wore it out of obligation rather than identity. He glanced first at Lucas, then at the barn, then at Rook, and finally at Coyle. That last look held something unsettled in it, quickly hidden. The bearded man checked the device and muttered, almost too low to hear, "Signal stopped here." Cale heard it anyway. So did Rook. The dog's ears went high, but he made no sound. Lucas walked forward, easy and careful, palms visible in a gesture designed to look non-threatening. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced, faintly warm in a way that did not extend to his eyes. "I'm Lucas Vane, Iron Valley Animal Recovery. Sorry to intrude. We're tracking a missing intake female from one of our satellite holding sites. Shepherd mix. Injured shoulder. Recently whelped litter." He said it too neatly. Kyle stood beside Harold, one hand loose near his thigh, posture neither inviting nor hostile. "You track your dogs?" "For safety," Lucas said with a sympathetic tilt of the head, as if anticipating concern and preparing to soothe it. "Some rescues require temporary monitoring if they've been seized from neglect situations, especially mothers under stress. They can bolt, hide, reject care." He gave a soft sigh that belonged in a brochure. "It's hard on everyone." Harold did not speak. Cale felt the old man's silence beside him like a held breath. Lucas's gaze shifted toward the barn and then back. "I understand you may have found her." "Maybe." Lucas smiled a little wider. "Then I'm grateful, truly. Weather like this, she and the pups won't last long without proper intervention." The bearded man took one step toward the barn. Rook moved. Not aggressively, not enough to justify complaint. He simply positioned himself slightly ahead of Coyle, body angled, eyes fixed on the man's hands. The younger man, Ethan, though Kyle did not know the name yet, watched that with a flicker of something close to respect. Lucas raised a hand to stop his companion. "No need to crowd things." He looked at Kyle again. "How long has she been here?" Kyle let the question sit. "You tell me." Something thin and hard passed through Lucas's expression before the smile returned. "Our logs would be more accurate once I verify the animal." "You know her name?" That landed. The bearded man looked down at the device. The younger one looked at Lucas. Harold's eyes sharpened. Lucas answered half a beat too late. "Our intake files are usually ID first, not name first in these cases." "So, No name. Cale nodded once, as if filing a technical detail. And the pups? Unregistered, obviously. We need them transferred as quickly as possible. Need, not want, not hope. Need. Behind Cale, Harold's coat sleeve brushed his own as the old man shifted weight. Fear, anger, and vindication all made similar small movements. Then came the moment that would stay with Cale, longer than Lucas's carefully arranged words. The younger man glanced toward the barn door just as a weak sound drifted through the wood from inside one of the puppies, barely strong enough to complain. Ethan's face changed. Not much, but enough. His eyes lowered, and for the first time since arriving, he looked ashamed. It lasted only a second. Lucas stepped closer, though still well outside reach. Mr. Rowan. Mr. Rowan. Lucas's tone deepened with manufactured understanding. I'm sure you mean well, but stressed postpartum animals can react badly to strangers. If you'll step aside, we can handle retrieval safely. Kyle held his gaze. Retrieval. Lucas did not blink. Rescue, retrieval, stabilization. Pick the noun you like best. The point is the same. No, it wasn't. Cale felt that truth settle in him without drama. The signal, the lack of a name, the wrong noun, the younger man's face, Harold's vanished dogs, the collar wound on the mother. All of it sat together now, not yet proof, but shape. Rook remained still. The mother dog and her puppies were in the barn 10 yards behind him, and for reasons Lucas Vane could not yet know, that distance had already become something he would not cross lightly. We're not done talking, Kyle said. Lucas's smile thinned, becoming less human and more managerial. Then let's make this easy on everyone. But the cold had changed by then, and so had the afternoon. Kyle could feel it. Not danger fully declared, not conflict openly chosen, but the first hard edge of something false arriving dressed as help. And he knew before another word was said that nothing about the men from Iron Valley had come here to save anything. Lucas Vane left the farm with the same measured politeness he had arrived with, but the politeness meant less once Cale had seen the machinery beneath it. The dark SUV backed slowly over the packed snow, tires crunching with controlled care, and turned down the drive without hurry. The men inside did not look back again. They did not need to. Men like Lucas preferred to leave the impression that they would return because return was natural to them, not because they had been forced to retreat. The engine sound faded beyond the trees, and the cold rushed back in to occupy the space they had disturbed. Harold Pike stood in the yard, with his hands jammed into the pockets of his patched canvas coat. The old man seemed suddenly more tired than before, as if the arrival of the vehicle had confirmed a private dread he had managed to keep unfinished for too long. His face, all dry lines and weather-burned angles, had gone pale beneath the red roughness of winter skin. You know them? Kyle asked. Harold shook his head once. No, but I know the kind of man who speaks too smoothly on a frozen driveway. That was accurate enough. Cale looked toward the barn. The mother dog and her 3 puppies remained inside, hidden for the moment by timber, shadow, and the simple fact that Lucas had not pushed the issue too hard. Not yet. That mattered less than it should have. People who asked the wrong questions gently often returned with harder tools. Rook stood beside Cale's leg, silent, ears half raised, his amber eyes still fixed toward the road long after the SUV had vanished. The black harness with its deep red trim lay dark against his winter coat. He looked less like a domestic dog in that light than a sentry left behind after the rest of the unit had moved on. Kyle exhaled slowly and felt the pull in his shoulder. The ache had sharpened from the cold and from the posture he had held in the barn. It was not enough to stop him. It was enough to remind him he should not waste motion. Keep the barn closed, he said. No one goes near her unless it's me. Harold frowned. You going somewhere? Cale's eyes moved toward the rear line of trees where the land dipped, and the daylight had already begun to thin into blue shadow. Not far. The old man did not ask why. Perhaps because he already knew. Perhaps because once suspicion had found a body to inhabit, it wanted ground under its feet. Snow had not started yet, but the sky carried the look of a day that would not end cleanly. Thin white light strained through high cloud, and the wind had shifted, coming lower across the fields. Kyle had seen enough northern weather in his short time there to understand the signs. Whatever he needed to learn, it would be easier now than after dark settled in full. He went back to the truck for a flashlight, his heavier gloves, and a spare knit cap. Rook followed without being called, then waited by the passenger door as if the shape of the afternoon had already been decided. Cale checked the battery in the flashlight, slid it into his jacket pocket, and looked once toward the road where Iron Valley had disappeared. If Lucas had been telling the truth, there would be records, names, veterinary contacts, proper procedure. There would have been urgency shaped by care, not ownership. Instead, there had been a tracking device, a missing name, and a language that treated a wounded mother and her pups like inventory. Kyle closed the truck door. Harold stood near the barn when he came back. You think they put her here? No, Cale said. I think she ran from somewhere and they expected to find her before anyone else did. Harold rubbed his jaw, the gray stubble catching on his glove. You think there's more than that dog out there? Cale looked toward the trees. I think there used to be. That was enough to silence them both. The forest behind Harold's property was not wild in the romantic sense. It had once been worked, cut in sections decades ago, then left to grow back unevenly. Old fence wire vanished into saplings. Half-rotted posts leaned out of drifts. The first few yards were open enough to walk without difficulty, but farther in the land folded strangely around old tracks, shallow gullies, and forgotten usage. Pine pressed close in some sections, while birch and alder crowded wetter ground in others. A man could get lost there, not because it was vast, but because it had too many small places to disappear. Rook did not charge ahead. That, more than anything, steadied Cale's thinking. The dog moved several paces in front, stopping often, head low, testing the air in brief pulls. Sometimes he would drift left and then back again, correcting himself not by confusion, but by information. Kyle let him do it. He had no interest in pretending human judgment alone would find what smell and instinct already understood. They crossed the rear boundary of Harold's land and entered the trees. The temperature dropped almost immediately. Snow remaining on the ground under the pines had a different quality than field snow. It stayed powder dry in shadow, protected from brief midday thaw, and muted sound in a way that made every boot step seem private. Kyle moved carefully, reading the spaces between trunks, the bent weed stems, the broken twigs half pressed into white. He found no clear path at first, only fragments, a scuffed patch beneath a low branch, a place where old needles had been disturbed, one fence strand clipped clean rather than torn. He crouched beside that last detail. Metal did not fray like that on its own. Behind him, the wind slipped through pine boughs with a hiss, like breath through teeth. Farther off, a woodpecker struck a dead trunk 3 hard times and went quiet. Kyle straightened and kept moving. The farther they went, the more the woods began to speak in leftovers. A narrow indentation half filled with blown snow suggested tires had come through weeks ago, maybe more recently, then vanished beneath drift and weather. A length of blue plastic snagged on bramble. A strip of frayed nylon caught under ice. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, but all of it belonged to the same kind of human presence. Temporary, careless, Utilitarian. Rook stopped near a stand of young birch and looked back at Kyle. Not a command. Not a performance. A check. Kale came forward and saw the ground fall away slightly into a shallow basin that could not be seen from Harold's fence line. It was sheltered on 3 sides by pine and scrub, and the snow lay thinner there where old packed surfaces still influenced the shape of the earth beneath. The place had the hidden quality of a site chosen by someone who did not want casual eyes finding it. At first it looked like nothing much. An open patch, brush, 2 leaning posts. Then Kyle let his eyes stop seeing woods and begin seeing use. A rectangle in the ground where repeated weight had compressed the earth beneath the frost. Rust stains along 2 boards that had once held hinges or wire. A stake pounded too straight into frozen soil to belong to chance. He moved deeper into the basin, and the pieces gathered around him. A kennel run had stood here once. Maybe more than one. Not large, not permanent in the legal sense, but real enough. The wire itself was mostly gone. Some had been cut and taken away. Some remained twisted low against a stump, where it had been ripped free in haste. The remains of lightweight panel fencing leaned under a tarp near the back. A dented steel bowl sat upside down in the snow, as if kicked there months earlier. Near it lay the cap of a syringe, yellowed and brittle from cold. Kyle knelt and picked it up between gloved fingers. He did not like the feeling that traveled through him then. It was too familiar. Too close to the cold, clean anger that came when damage had not been accidental. Rook moved to the edge of the clearing and halted beside a low structure almost hidden by brush. It had once been a utility shed, or feed shelter, no bigger than a truck bed, built roughly and abandoned roughly. The door hung askew. Snow had blown through the gap and collected in uneven fingers across the floor. Kyle approached from the side, one hand already near the flashlight, though the light outside had not fully died yet. Inside were the remains of use stripped in a hurry. A cracked plastic bin. Torn packaging from cheap antibiotics meant for livestock. A small stack of intake forms soaked, frozen, and partly disintegrated where the roof had leaked. He lifted the top page carefully. Ink had run, but not all of it. There were columns, dates, weight estimates. In one corner, a printed logo blurred but still partly legible beneath water damage. Not Iron Valley. Something else had been covered over. That thought stayed with him as he set the paper back down. Rook, who had remained at the doorway, made a sound Kale had not heard from him in years. Not a bark, not a growl, but a short, low whine from deep in the chest. It was the sound the dog made only in the presence of pain he could not reach. Kale turned fast enough that the old injury bit through his shoulder. The dog was staring not at the shed, not at Kyle, but at a small patch of half-frozen ground near the rear fence line. Kyle crossed to it and brushed snow aside with his gloved hand. Under the crusted white lay a leather collar. Not broken. Cut. The leather was cheap, brown once, darkened now by wet and age. On the metal tag hung from it, the letters had been scratched but not erased completely. Enough remained to read a single name. Molly. Kyle sat back on his heels with the collar in his hand and understood without needing Harold there to say it that one of the old man's missing dogs had not simply wandered off. He closed his fist around the collar for a second, feeling the stiff, cracked leather press into his palm, and something in the woods seemed to narrow around that fact. It was no longer a suspicion living in stories and empty dark. It had become evidence that could be touched. When he rose, the sky had dimmed another shade. He kept searching, slower now, building the place in his mind. The kennel frames had been portable. The site itself improvised. No insulation, no true heating, no long-term capacity. This was not a grand operation. It was worse in some ways for being small. Small things hurt quietly, and were harder to notice until they had done enough damage to leave ghosts behind. Near the edge of the basin, he found tire impressions preserved where deeper cold had hardened the mud beneath the snow before the latest freeze. The tread was narrow, utility grade. Beside them ran another track. Something dragged or rolled on a smaller wheeled frame. A transport crate, maybe. He looked back toward Harold's property through the trees and imagined the mother dog limping through this dark with her body not yet healed from birth, carrying fear and instinct in equal measure until she found the old barn. Not brought there. Escaped there. Rook returned to his side and nudged once against Kyle's leg, grounding rather than urging. The dog's coat had picked up dry needles and white dust from the snow. His eyes remained fixed and serious. "Yeah," Kyle murmured. "I see it." He made one more pass through the clearing and found what mattered most near the shed wall under a strip of warped metal roofing. A stamped veterinary supply box with part of a shipping label still attached. The return address had smudged, but the delivery name had not. Iron Valley Annex B. There it was. Not enough for court. Not enough to stop men like Lucas by itself. But enough to turn intuition into direction. Snow began then, light at first, a few dry flakes slipping between the branches. Then more. The kind that did not melt on cloth, but gathered, patient and cumulative. Kyle tucked the cut collar into his jacket pocket, memorized the layout of the hidden holding site, and stepped back from it with reluctance he did not indulge. He and Rook made their way toward Harold's property as the woods dimmed toward evening. The dog no longer stopped as often now. He had found what he needed to tell. The rest belonged to men, and whatever they chose to do with truth once it had a shape. By the time the barn came into view again, the world had softened under the first real fall of snow. Harold stood near the side door of the house, looking toward the tree line with the posture of a man who already feared the answer. Kyle walked straight to him and took the collar from his pocket. Harold looked at it, and all the blood seemed to leave his face. For a moment the old man did not touch it. Then he reached out with both hands, as though accepting something breakable. His thumb moved over the remaining letters once, twice. "Molly," he said, and the name came out torn. Kyle said nothing. Harold stared past him into the darkening trees. "I knew," he whispered, though he sounded like a man confessing to himself, not to another. "I knew something took them. I just didn't know what kind of something." Snow gathered on the shoulders of his coat and on the white edges of his hair. He looked suddenly smaller, not in body, but in certainty. Kyle glanced toward the barn where the wounded mother and her puppies still waited behind old wood and fragile calm. Then he looked back to the trees, where the hidden basin now lay under fresh snow, already beginning to disappear again. What he had found there was enough to understand the shape of the lie. Not enough to stop it. Not yet. The snow began in earnest before full dark. It came first as a fine white drift against the barn door, then as a steadier fall that softened the fence posts, blurred the tree line, and turned Harold Pike's back field into a pale emptiness without depth or edge. By the time Kyle stepped out of the house again with a lantern in one hand and a box of supplies in the other, the world had already begun to close in on itself. Sound traveled differently in snowfall. It was not silence exactly. It was a muffling, as if the storm took every hard outline of the world and wrapped it in thick cloth. Harold followed him as far as the porch and stopped there. The old man had not fully recovered from seeing Molly's collar. His face still looked as though something inside it had been struck and left ringing. He had changed into a heavier coat, one of those dark, insulated farm jackets that had outlived fashion by 20 winters, but no amount of wool or canvas could hide the age that had settled on him in the last hour. His hands, rough and cracked, gripped the porch rail as though the wood itself were the only thing in reach that made sense. "You sure you know what you're doing?" he asked. It was not a challenge. It was what people asked when they needed to believe somebody did. Kyle adjusted the strap of the med kit against his uninjured shoulder. "No." Harold stared at him. Kyle glanced once towards the barn, where a faint shape of yellow light showed through a gap in the boards. "I know enough to go slow." That seemed to land better than false confidence would have. Harold rubbed his jaw, white stubble scraping against his glove. "I can stay." "You can be close," Cale said, "but not inside unless I call." The old man gave one sharp nod. Grief had made him brittle but not stupid. He understood now that the mother dog's fear was part wound, part memory. Another male body crowding the room would not help. Rook waited at the foot of the steps, already harnessed, snow dusting the sable ridge of his back. He looked up once as Kyle approached, then turned toward the barn, without impatience. 6 years old, lean and broad through the chest in the practical way of a working-line German shepherd. He held himself with a discipline that always made stillness look active. The black harness with its dark red trim had gone dull from years of weather and hands. It belonged to the dog the way Kyle's old boots belonged to him. Worn, functional, tested. Together they crossed the yard. The barn smelled warmer than the world outside, though only by comparison. Dry straw, old wood, dust, and animal breath met them when Kyle pushed the door inward with his boot. He had left it nearly closed to hold what little shelter it could. The lantern light trembled across the interior, catching on warped boards, broken shelving, and the rough nest in the back corner where the mother dog still lay curled around the puppies. She saw them immediately. Her head lifted, eyes wide and gold-brown in the dimness, and the thin skin around her muzzle drew tight with strain. She did not waste strength on growling at first. She simply held herself rigid, every rib sharp under the dirt-matted fur of her sides. In better health, she might once have been beautiful, shepherd-shaped, long-nosed, deep-chested, intelligent. Now she looked like what cruelty made of living things when it was given enough time. The raw mark around her neck had darkened against the patchy fur there. The wound at the shoulder remained swollen and ugly, old blood clotted at the edges. Every line of her body said the same thing: used hard, denied rest, and left to protect more life than she could afford. The 3 puppies were gathered close to her belly, tiny and unfinished looking, their bodies so small they seemed made of warmth and trembling rather than flesh. One gave a weak twitch. Another rooted blindly against its mother's underside. The third lay half-hidden beneath her front leg, its side moving so faintly Cale had to look twice to be sure it still breathed. He set the lantern down far enough away not to throw light directly into her face. Then he crouched, careful of the shoulder, and opened the supply box one item at a time where she could see each movement. Water, towels, a small metal bowl, a wool blanket folded tight, a length of clean cloth. Nothing sharp, nothing sudden. Rook entered after him and did what he had done before. He lowered himself to the floor without approaching the nest. Chest down, head turned slightly aside, gaze soft but alert. He did not look at the puppies first. He looked toward the mother, then toward Kyle. Then settled into stillness so complete it seemed almost ceremonial. A creature offering no claim, no challenge, no demand. Kyle poured warm water into the bowl from the thermos Harold had given him. Steam barely rose before the cold took it. He nudged the bowl forward a few inches across the boards and stopped. The mother dog tracked the bowl with her eyes, then snapped her attention back to him. "That's fine," Cale said quietly. "You don't owe me trust." He meant it. Trust was a luxury people talked about as if it were noble. Sometimes survival only needed tolerance. He took one of the towels and folded it into a thicker pad. The movement of his hands made her tense again. Rook's ears flicked once, and then, almost imperceptibly, he stretched one foreleg forward and rested his chin on it, making himself look smaller than he was. Kyle had seen men do brave things before. Most of them were loud. This was not. This was a dog choosing vulnerability because force would fail. The mother's breathing changed. Only a little. Less ragged, less immediate. Her eyes shifted to Rook, and for a moment she forgot Kyle enough to lower her muzzle toward the nearest pup, touching its back with exhausted care. Kyle left the folded towel on the floor, still too far to matter much, but closer than before. Outside, the wind pushed snow against the barn wall with a dry, rushing sound. The roof answered with old creaks, as though winter had put a hand on it and meant to keep pressing. Kyle remained crouched until his knees began to burn. The shoulder tightened further from holding himself so carefully, but he stayed there. He had learned long ago that urgency often ruined what patience could save. He did not know who had hurt this dog. He did know the shape of damage when he saw it. Damage taught living things to expect pain from movement, from voices, from help. If he came too fast, she would remember only that a man had reached toward her young. One of the puppies, smallest of the three, a pale little thing with barely any strength behind its body, slid away from the curve of its mother's stomach. It did not crawl so much as drift, pushed by its own weak rooting and the angle of straw beneath it, until it reached the edge of the nest and tumbled onto the rough floorboards. The mother lurched. Her injured shoulder buckled halfway through the motion, and the effort that followed was terrible to watch. She tried to rise, failed, and tried again, dragging herself forward by instinct more than strength. The tiny pup let out a thin, broken squeak that did not even sound like fear yet, only cold. Kyle's whole body tightened to move. Rook got there first. Not with speed that frightened the room, with precision. He stood, crossed the space in 2 quiet steps, and lowered himself beside the fallen puppy without touching it. Then, carefully, deliberately, he curled his body just enough to block the draft coming through a crack in the boards. He became a wall of warmth between the pup and the cold floor. No nudge, no mouth, no interference, only shelter. The mother froze, her eyes locked on him. Kyle had 1 second to ruin or honor what the dog had just done. He chose stillness. No one moved. The lantern hissed softly. Snow whispered against the walls. Harold shifted once outside on the porch, the sound so faint it might have been memory. The puppy's tiny body trembled against the barn floorboards. The mother dragged herself 1 more inch forward, then stopped. Rook did not look at her directly. He did not claim the pup. He only guarded it from the cold until she could decide whether his presence meant danger. When she did not snap, Kyle exhaled for the first time in what felt like a minute. Slowly, carefully, he drew the wool blanket toward him and folded part of it into a thicker barrier along the wall where the worst draft slipped in. Then he sat back on his heels and waited. At length, painfully, almost unbelievingly, the mother stretched her muzzle toward the puppy on the floor and touched its side. Rook eased back 1/2 foot, making room without surrendering the warmth his body had gathered there. The pup gave another weak sound. The mother, trembling violently now, hooked the little body toward her with 1 paw and pulled it into the hollow of her chest. Only after the puppy was back against her did she look up at Rook again. Something changed. Not trust. Not gratitude. Those were human words for cleaner worlds. But a calculation altered. She no longer saw only a threat. Kyle understood it at once, and because he did, He changed nothing about the pace of his movements. He unfolded another towel, then another, and layered them near the edge of the nest rather than inside it. He shifted the water bowl a fraction closer while she was busy nosing each puppy in turn. Then he took the wool blanket, folded it once, and braced it against the worst gap in the wall to soften the draft without trapping the room into dampness. The mother watched every motion, yet each time her gaze returned to Rook, it held less raw panic than before. Kyle's shoulder throbbed now in a hot, narrow line down into his upper arm. Kneeling and reaching with care had awakened the injury fully. He felt his patience thinning at the edges, not emotionally, but physically, the body's crude way of reminding the mind that endurance still had a cost. He shifted backward, sat against an upright beam, and let the pain settle rather than fight it. "You picked a bad place," he said quietly to the dog. "But maybe it'll hold." Rook returned to his earlier position, though a little closer now. Not enough to intrude. Enough that the warmth from his body might reach the outer edge of the nest if the wind worsened. For the first time since Kyle had entered, the mother lowered her head fully to the straw instead of holding it above her pups. Her eyes stayed open. Her body remained coiled around them, but she accepted the floor for one breath, then another. Borrowed trust, Kale thought. Not given. Loaned, and only through the dog. He stayed another half hour, maybe more. Time in barns during storms moved differently. He refreshed the water once, saw the mother finally stretch her neck enough to lick at it in quick, suspicious laps, and watched one of the puppies knead weakly against her belly. Life, then. Fragile, but life. When he rose to leave, his boots creaked softly against the boards. The mother's eyes followed him, but she did not bare her teeth. Rook stood too, shook a light dust of straw from his coat, and looked once back at her before coming to Kyle's side. Harold was still on the porch when they crossed the yard. "Well?" the old man asked. Kyle stopped under the thin yellow light above the door. Snow had gathered on Harold's shoulders and in the creases of his cap. He looked cold enough to crack. "She let him help," Kyle said, nodding toward Rook. Harold looked down at the dog, then back toward the barn. "Not you?" "No." That seemed to humble the old man more than surprise him. Inside the house, the kitchen felt overheated after the barn. Harold poured coffee into thick, chipped mugs and said nothing for a while. Kyle stood by the sink, flexing the hand on his bad side until the ache dulled. Through the window, he could just make out the barn roof under snow, a darker shape against the field. "She'll die if they take her?" Harold asked at last. Kale thought of the collar mark, the hidden kennel, the supply box stamped with Iron Valley's name, the careful, bloodless language Lucas had used. "Yes," he said. Harold nodded once, as if he had expected nothing else. He did not ask what came next. Neither did Kale. Outside, snow kept falling over the barn, the field, the hidden place in the woods, and every track that had led living things there. Inside the old house, Kale stood with his coffee cooling in his hand and understood one thing clearly. The mother dog had not chosen him. She had chosen Rook. And that thin, reluctant mercy was the only bridge keeping all 4 lives within reach. The storm settled over Harold Pike's farm the way a trap settled over a careless leg, quietly at first, then all at once. By midnight, the world outside had narrowed to snow, wind, and whatever a lantern could reach before the dark swallowed it. The barn roof groaned under fresh weight. The gaps in the boards hissed with driven powder. Frost had begun to silver the inside edges of the lower planks, where cold kept winning small battles against the warmth of living bodies. The field beyond the house no longer looked like land. It looked like absence. Kyle stood just inside the barn door, listening. He had done what he could in the last hour without breaking the thin mercy Rook had earned. A second blanket had been fixed against the worst draft near the back wall. A shallow pan of water sat close enough for the mother dog to reach if thirst overcame suspicion. He had dragged 2 old feed sacks and a warped crate into a rough barrier near the entrance, not to block the room, but to narrow how quickly anyone could come inside. It was the sort of practical preparation that would have looked unnecessary to a man who still believed trouble announced itself loudly before arriving. Kyle no longer believed that. The mother dog remained wrapped around her 3 puppies in the rear corner, her body curved so tightly around them that she seemed made of one instinct only. Exhaustion had not made her gentle. It had only stripped her down to what she could not surrender. Her eyes followed Kyle whenever he moved. The gold brown in them had a strange depth in lantern light, as if fear had stained itself there over many nights and refused to fade. She still did not trust him. She tolerated his existence because Rook existed beside it. That mattered more than any human intention. Rook lay several feet from her nest, close enough that his body heat softened the cold at the edge of the room, far enough not to crowd. He had not slept. His ears moved constantly, catching shifts in the barn, in Kyle's breathing, in the weather beyond the boards. At 6 years old, he no longer wasted energy proving he was ready. He simply was. The black harness with its dark red trim was powdered faintly with barn dust and snowmelt. One front paw rested over the other. To anyone who did not understand working dogs, he might have looked calm. Kyle knew calm was often just discipline wearing a quiet face. Harold had finally gone back into the house at Kyle's insistence. The old man had argued only once. Then he had looked toward the barn, toward the thing hidden in it, and toward the woods beyond, and something in his tired face had given way to weary obedience. He was no coward. He was simply old enough to know that standing in the wrong place during the wrong moment helped no one. Cale checked the radio again. It was an old handheld unit Harold had kept from better years, supplemented by Cale's own truck radio battery pack, and a length of stripped wire improvised as a crude extension. Ugly work, but functional in the way field solutions sometimes had to be. He had tested it twice already. Static had answered both times, shredded by wind and distance, but not total silence. Somewhere out in the weather, other signals still existed. Whether anyone would hear his clearly enough when it mattered was another question. He kept the radio on anyway. The shoulder hurt. Not sharply now, but with that deep, dull insistence that came after too many hours compensating around damage. Every time he lifted the bad arm higher than he should, a line of fire moved down into his upper back. It annoyed him more than it frightened him. Pain that stayed consistent could be worked with. Sudden failure was worse. The storm slammed itself across the north wall. The mother dog flinched but did not rise. One of the puppies gave a tiny, choking sound and rooted blindly against her belly. Rook's head came up. Kyle looked over, saw the pup settle and exhaled. Then Rook stood. Not slowly, not uncertainly. One clean motion, all attention forward, ears high, body pointed at the barn doors. Kyle went still. He heard it 2 seconds later. Engines. More than one. Muted by snow, but heavy enough to travel through the frozen ground before they fully reached the ear. They were not passing along the county road. They were coming in on Harold's drive, pushing through drift and dark with the confidence of men who already knew where they intended to stop. Kyle did not curse. Men who cursed at moments like this usually believed anger itself was a plan. He clicked the lantern lower, not out, and picked up the radio. The mother dog had heard the engines, too. Her body changed all at once, not with surprise, with recognition. She gathered the puppies tighter beneath her chest, shoulder shaking violently, lips drawing back over her teeth in a warning so weak It broke the heart more than it threatened. Her fear no longer pointed at Kyle. It pointed outward. That told him everything he needed. The smallest puppy, the one that had slipped earlier and survived only because of Rook's instinct, let out a thin cry at the sound of the approaching vehicles. The mother, trembling hard enough that the straw around her seemed to quiver with her, did something Cale had not seen her do once all night. She looked not at him, but at Rook. Directly. Fully. For one suspended second, all the terror in her face passed through that look and became something stranger, an appeal she would never have made to a human hand. Rook answered by moving closer to the nest. He did not touch her. He simply placed himself between the rear corner and the center aisle of the barn, body turned outward, the line of his back saying with simple certainty, "If something comes, it comes through me first." It was not a trick. It was not sentiment. It was a decision. And in the corner, the mother dog stopped showing her teeth. The vehicle stopped outside. Doors opened. Wind drove voices into fragments. Bootsteps approached through snow. Kyle pressed the radio transmit button once and spoke low and clear. "This is Cale Rowan at Harold Pike's farm on the north edge of North Hollow Ridge. Possible animal abuse situation. 3, maybe more, on site returning during storm conditions. If anyone copies, I need county response and veterinary support." Static swallowed half of it. He released the button, waited, heard only hiss, then set the radio on an overturned crate where the microphone would remain live if needed. The barn doors shuddered under a hard knock. "Mr. Rowan!" Lucas Vane's voice carried through the wood with practiced patience. "Open up. This has gone on long enough." Kyle did not move to obey. He moved to the side instead, forcing the entrance into a narrower angle if they came through. Rook remained planted. The knock came again, harder. Then the door pushed inward. Snow blew across the threshold in a white burst, and Lucas entered first, ducking slightly under the warped frame. He looked less polished than before. Snow clung to the shoulders of his dark rescue jacket. His knit cap was wet through along the edges. The careful urban calm still sat on his face, but now it was stretched thinner, worn over irritation that had begun to show through. Behind him came the broad, bearded man from earlier, carrying a collapsible metal crate. A second man Cale had not seen before followed close behind, with a catch pole in one hand. This new man was thick through the neck and chest, built like somebody who mistook mass for authority. He wore a dark work parka stained at one cuff and a black knit cap pulled low. A beard covered most of his jaw, not well kept, just heavy. His nose had been broken once and healed slightly crooked, giving his blunt face an old violence. Men like him often learned early that size opened doors, conversation would not. Whether he had ever been punished for that lesson was another matter. Ethan Cole came last. Snow had melted into the brown hair showing beneath his hat. His face looked paler than before, younger in the bad light and more tired too. The stubble along his jaw seemed darker now that his skin had lost color. He held no equipment. That detail mattered. He had come because Lucas wanted bodies, not because Ethan had volunteered for force. Lucas took in the barn in one smooth glance, the repositioned crate, the lantern, Cale's stance, Rook at the rear, the mother hidden partly in shadow. His mouth tightened. "You're escalating this," he said. Kyle kept his voice even. "You brought a catchpole into a barn with newborns. They are not safe here." The bearded man shifted the crate in his hands. Metal rang softly against metal. The mother dog's breath hitched in the corner. Rook's weight moved forward half an inch. "She wasn't safe where she came from either," Kyle said. Lucas gave him the look bureaucrats saved for people who refused to be managed. "You have no idea what you're talking about. I know you don't know her name." Something flashed behind Lucas's eyes. Then annoyance stripped briefly of polish. Names don't matter. Intake numbers do. The thick man with the catch pole snorted softly, as though the conversation bored him. Ethan looked at the floor. Kyle reached for the one thing men like Lucas hated most: specificity. "I found the holding site in the trees," he said. "Panels, wire, supply waste, Iron Valley Annex B on a veterinary box. Harold Pike's missing dog collar cut and discarded in the snow." For the first time, silence cracked the group open. The bearded man looked at Lucas. The thick one frowned. Ethan closed his eyes for one beat too long. Lucas recovered first. "You found an abandoned staging area used during temporary overflow. Hardly illegal." "No heat," Kyle said. "No proper housing. Cut fencing. Drug caps on the ground. That dog's neck says more than your paperwork does." "That dog," Lucas replied, and now all the warmth had drained from his voice, "is Iron Valley property pending transfer." The word landed ugly in the room. Property. In the back corner, the mother dog made a low sound unlike any she had made before. Not loud, not strong, just broken and raw. Ethan flinched as if struck. Kyle did not miss it. Neither, perhaps, did the radio. He glanced once toward the open microphone on the crate. Lucas followed the look too late. Ethan spoke before anyone else could. "She wasn't supposed to be there this long." The sentence came out barely above a whisper, but in the barn it might as well have been shouted. The thick man turned toward him. The bearded one went completely still. Lucas's face changed with terrifying speed, not into rage, but into the colder shape beneath it. Ethan swallowed. His hands were empty at his sides, fingers shaking once before he closed them. "They said county inspection might come through before the transfer paperwork was fixed. We were supposed to move the litters out. Just temporary. That's what he said." He did not point at Lucas. He did not need to. Lucas took one step toward him. "Shut up." But the dam had cracked. "No heat in the back run," Ethan said, louder now, voice scraping against itself as if unused to honesty. "Expired meds relabeled. Records changed after intake. Dogs moved when people asked questions. I loaded some of them." His face twisted with something uglier than fierce self-disgust arriving too late. "I told myself it was temporary." The thick man cursed under his breath. The bearded one set the crate down slowly, as if sudden movements had become dangerous in a new direction. Kyle hit the transmit button on the radio without looking away. "You copy that?" he said into the open air. "Witness statement on active abuse and falsified records at Iron Valley holding site." Static exploded back. Then, faintly, far off through the storm, a clipped male voice broke apart across the speaker. "Copy partial. Repeat location." It was enough. Lucas knew it, too. The mask came off his face then, not dramatically, just all at once, leaving behind the man who had been using it. "You stupid kid," he said to Ethan, voice flat with contempt. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ethan looked at the mother dog huddled around her puppies, then at Rook standing guard between them and every human in the room. "Yeah," he said, almost toneless. "I think I do." No one moved for several seconds. Snow drove through the half-open door. The lantern flame jittered. The mother dog panted in the dark, not trusting the silence any more than Cale did. Rook did not look back at her. He kept his eyes on the men. Lucas's next expression was not anger. It was calculation with nowhere good left to go. He took one slow step backward. "This isn't over," he said. Kyle did not answer. The bearded man lifted the crate again, but differently now, no longer with confidence. The thick one lowered the catch pole. Ethan did not move until Lucas brushed past him toward the door. Then he followed with the unsteady gait of someone who had finally stepped off the wrong side of his own excuses. The cold rushed in as they left. A moment later, the engine started again. Cale waited until the sound had faded before he released the breath he had been holding. Only then did Rook turn back toward the corner. The mother dog remained curled around her puppies, shaking from exhaustion more than panic now. But she was alive. The puppies were alive. And outside, somewhere through miles of storm and static, a truth had found a way into the air. That was not safety, but it was no longer silence. For a few minutes after the engines faded, the storm sounded louder than it had before. It pressed against the barn from every side, with the blind persistence of weather that had outgrown inconvenience and become danger. Snow drove through the cracks in the boards in thin white breaths. The roof groaned again, longer this time, and somewhere above the rafters a load shifted with the deep, dragging sound of weight looking for a weak place to go. The lantern flame near the wall shivered so hard it made the shadows seem alive. Kyle stood still and listened until listening became arithmetic. Roof, wind, snow load, temperature dropping. 3 newborn puppies that could not survive a long transfer. A mother dog already near collapse. Harold's old radio catching only fragments through static. Iron Valley gone for now, but not gone in any way that mattered. His shoulder burning in a line from collarbone to spine every time he moved the arm too high. He looked toward the back corner. The mother dog had not shifted from around her pups, but what strength remained in her now looked borrowed even from a distance. She was breathing with her mouth open, not from aggression, but from pain and fatigue. The raw collar wound dark against the dirty pale fur at her throat. Her eyes stayed on Kyle, though the panic inside them had flattened into something harder and emptier. She no longer seemed to expect mercy or cruelty. Only consequence. Rook stood between her and the aisle, still as a carved thing, chest forward, ears angled toward the door and the world beyond it. The black harness sat dark against his winter coat, dusted with bits of straw. In the wavering light, his amber eyes looked almost copper. He had held the line all night in the quiet way only creatures without ego could manage. The radio crackled. Not clearly. Not enough. Just a burst of interference, and a broken male voice somewhere far out in the weather. Cale crossed the barn in 3 careful steps, grabbed the handset, and pressed the transmit key. "This is Cale Rowan at Harold Pike's farm," he said. "North edge of North Hollow Ridge. Injured mother dog, 3 newborn pups. Possible abuse confirmed. Need transport and vet response. Storm worsening." Static tore through the reply. Then, faintly, "Here. Rowan. Hold. Road unit." That was all. But it was not nothing. Kyle lowered the radio and let one breath leave him slowly. Somewhere, somebody had heard enough to know there was a man in a storm asking for help. That might save no one. It might save everyone. He had lived long enough to know the difference often came down to whether another human being chose to turn a wheel in the right direction. Behind him, the roof complained again. This time the sound was sharper. Timber answering force with the voice of age. Kyle turned toward the corner. "We're out of time." The mother dog's ears twitched at his voice, but she did not rise. The pups were hidden under the curve of her ribs and belly, small lives measured in fractions. If he tried to lift them by hand, she would fight. Maybe weakly, maybe not. Fear made poor animals do impossible things for one last minute. If she panicked in here, one puppy could be crushed under her before he reached them. He looked at Rook. The dog held his gaze for 1 second, then turned his head towards the old feed-room door at the side of the barn, where Harold had stacked broken tools, scrap lumber, and unused winter gear. Not a trick. Not magic. Just memory and utility meeting in the same mind. Kyle followed it. He found the sled in pieces. Not a proper rescue sled. Only the remains of one Harold must once have used to haul feed or firewood through snow-2 steel runners, weathered wood slats, a cracked pull rope, and one corner split near the front brace. Useless for weight, possible for necessity. He carried what he could into the center aisle and knelt to work. The shoulder nearly failed him on the first lift. Fire ran through the joint so fast his vision went white at the edges for a second. He stopped, breathed, shifted the angle, and kept going with his other arm, taking more than it should. The old military watch at his wrist knocked against the wood each time he tightened a bolt with numb fingers. He did not waste thought on the pain. Pain asked for attention the way weather did. Sometimes it deserved none. Harold came into the barn midway through the effort, snow thick on his shoulders, a flashlight in one hand, and a canvas tool pouch in the other. "I heard the roof," he said. Kyle did not look up. "Then you know why I need those pliers." Harold set the pouch beside him without argument. The old man had crossed some private line in the last few hours. Fear still lived in him, but it no longer had the field to itself. His face, cut deep by weather and age, had taken on the rigid calm of men who had already lost enough that hesitation began to feel obscene. Together, working mostly without words, they made the sled honest enough to matter. Kyle lashed the split corner with wire. Harold found a pair of intact eyelets in a box of junk and fitted the rope through them with hands rough but steady. They layered the sled bed with folded sacks, the wool blanket, and 2 dry towels warmed briefly by the stove before Harold had brought them out. Nothing about it looked trustworthy. That meant nothing. Plenty of things that looked professional failed when they were needed. He had expected resistance from the mother dog. Teeth. Panic. A desperate collapse over the pups. Instead, when the sled stopped in view and Rook moved to stand beside it, she looked at the makeshift bed, then at the dog, then back at her puppies. One of them made a thin mewling sound and stretched blindly toward warmth it could not name. The mother lowered her muzzle over all 3, and for one suspended moment Cale saw something pass through her face that had nothing to do with fear. Recognition. Not of him, not of the sled, of necessity. The look was so clear it struck him harder than any growl could have. She knew. Somehow, beneath the pain and exhaustion and animal confusion of it all, she knew the barn had turned from shelter into a grave if she stayed. Rook lowered his head once and stood waiting. The mother did not bare her teeth. That was the permission they were going to get. Kyle moved carefully, every motion announced before he made it. He slid the sled close enough that the mother could see the lined bed and smell the warmed cloth. Then he crouched, and, with Rook positioned at the front edge as a living reassurance, reached for the nearest pup. The mother tensed. Rook did not touch her. He only stayed. Kyle gathered the tiny body in both hands, shocked again by how little weight there was to it, by how something so fragile could still be clinging so hard to life. He laid the pup into the blanket nest and immediately stepped back. No theft, no suddenness. Let her see it remain within reach. The mother strained forward, nose shaking, and looked to Rook again. Then she let Kyle take the second. And the third. By the time all 3 puppies lay together in the sled, wrapped but not smothered, Cale's shoulder was trembling so hard from controlled strain he could barely close his fingers. He flexed the hand once, swallowed the nausea that pain sometimes brought, and looked at the mother dog. "You too," he said quietly, though he knew the words themselves meant nothing. She tried to stand and failed. Harold took one step forward. "I can—" "No," Cale said, sharper than he intended. He softened his voice immediately. "Not from above. She'll fight it. He took the blanket, folded it lengthwise, and slid it slowly along the floor until it touched her paws. Rook shifted to her side, close enough now that their fur nearly brushed. The mother panted once, hard, then, trembling, she dragged herself partly onto the blanket. It took both men. Harold lifted one end with the caution of a man carrying memory more than weight. Kyle took the other with his good arm, and the hurt one doing only what it had to. Together they raised just enough for her body to settle onto the sled behind the pups, not beside them, not separated, but where she could smell them and keep her eyes on them. She did not snap. She looked only at Rook. That was enough. When Cale opened the barn door, the storm entered like a physical thing. Wind slammed across the threshold with a force that bent the lantern flame flat and drove snow into every exposed seam of clothing. Harold cursed this time, a raw old farmer's curse that vanished into the gale before it fully formed. The yard had become a white blur, broken only by the dim light from the house and the black shapes of fence posts. Beyond that, the world no longer existed in any useful way. Kyle took the sled rope across his chest and shoulder and nearly laughed at the stupidity of it as pain flared through the injured joint. Then he leaned his weight forward and pulled. The sled moved. Not smoothly, not well, but it moved. Harold walked to one side with the flashlight low, shielding the beam with his hand to keep it from blinding them in the snow. Rook stayed near the back half of the sled, close enough that the mother dog could keep him in sight. She had no strength left for anything but breathing and watching. The pups were nearly invisible beneath the folds of blanket, only 3 tiny shapes gathered in the hollow. Halfway across the yard, a new engine sound broke through the wind. Not Lucas. Too heavy. Too broad in the throat of the motor. Then a wash of amber light swung across the storm from the road beyond the fence, blinking through the snow in pulses. Harold made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. That'll be Calvin. The vehicle that emerged from the white was a county plow truck, old and yellow under the snow, blade packed with ice and road grime, roof lights spinning amber through the storm like some stubborn machine refusing the night. It came down the drive with the ungraceful certainty of equipment built for weather, uglier than this. The driver's door opened before the truck fully settled. Calvin Reese climbed out, wearing an orange winter parka so faded at the seams it looked older than some marriages. He was in his late 50s or early 60s, heavy through the chest and shoulders, with a gray beard crusted at the edges from frozen breath, and a knit cap jammed low over a face made square and rough by decades of wind, coffee, bad sleep, and county roads. His nose had the permanent redness of a man who lived half his life in winter. His eyes, pale and practical, missed nothing. He carried himself like somebody who had spent 40 years turning toward trouble, simply because roads did not clear themselves. He took in the sled, Kyle, Harold, the dog, the storm, and said, "Well, this is about as ugly as the radio made it sound." There was no panic in him, no performance, only decision. "Rear compartment's warmer," he said, already moving. "Not warm enough, but better than this. Vet and sheriff are following my signal from county line. Bridge slowed them." Together they loaded the sled into the plow's rear utility section, where blankets, road flares, tow chains, and emergency gear had been shoved aside to make space. Calvin threw in another insulated blanket from the cab, without being asked. Harold climbed up once, just enough to tuck the edge around the pups with trembling hands, then stepped back as though aware this was not his place anymore. Kyle climbed in after them. Rook sprang up beside the sled without command. The mother dog saw him and settled by fractions. Outside, through the snow, a second pair of lights appeared far down the road. Then a third. Calvin slammed the rear door most of the way, leaving a gap for air and for Kyle to see out. "Sheriff and Doc Arlen," he shouted over the wind. "Told you somebody heard." The plow rocked as he climbed back into the driver's seat. Kyle sat on the metal floor, one hand braced against the wall, the other resting lightly near the blanket nest where 3 tiny lives still breathed in threads. Rook lay lengthwise between the mother dog and the open gap, eyes never leaving her. She was no calmer, not really. But she had stopped looking for a place to flee. The engine surged. The plow began to turn. Outside, blue law light and clean white headlights broke through the storm at last, blurred by snow but unmistakable. The help came late, imperfect, and through weather that wanted to bury everything before morning. It came anyway, and inside the shaking plow, with his shoulder burning and cold in his teeth, and the smallest of the puppies making one more faint, stubborn sound beneath the blankets, Kyle understood that the night had not ended in safety. Only in movement. Sometimes that had to be enough. Sometimes a miracle does not arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes as one more breath in a freezing room, one loyal soul who refuses to leave, one stranger who turns back in the storm, or one wounded heart that still chooses to protect what it loves. And sometimes, what we call luck is really the quiet mercy of God, moving through ordinary people, ordinary hands, and ordinary moments that become holy because someone chose compassion instead of turning away. In daily life, most of us do not face blizzards, hidden barns, or roads lost under snow, but we all meet people carrying pain we cannot fully see. We all pass moments when we can ignore, delay, or step closer. That is where faith begins to matter. Not only in prayer, but in kindness. Not only in what we believe, but in what we do when someone fragile is placed in our path. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, and tell us what part of this story stayed with you the most. And if you believe stories of loyalty, mercy, courage, and God's quiet miracles still matter, please subscribe to the channel and help us keep bringing these stories to life. May God bless you, protect your home, strengthen your heart, and send peace over every burden you are carrying tonight. May He watch over the ones you love, guide your steps in dark seasons, and remind you that even in the coldest moments, His light can still find you.